Loud?
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to transfer the presentation for you. Just let me know if you have controlled that. If any of the assistants have a question, just let us know through the Skype. I'm sorry, through the chat.
So can you hear us? Hello?
Hello, Doctor. Yes, we can hear you. And
Okay.
the presentation
Okay,
is
perfect.
getting started. Just wait a couple of minutes to see if the presentation is in the screen of the participants. Yes, we can see your presentation. So go ahead, Dr. Pasupati, and participants. Thank you very much for attending this. I hope our participants enjoyed it as well, this conference. So all yours, over to you.
Thank you, Diego. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Thank you very much, first of all, for joining this presentation. And as Diego was 2015, and to have you all join for this particular webinar, where the topic is on promoting cooperation and synergies among the biodiversity-related conventions of the multilateral environmental agreements, where what I'm trying to do is to take you very quickly through not only the need for looking at synergies and cooperation, but where does it fit within the overall framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity's decisions and actions, but also where the national biodiversity strategies and action plans could play a very, very important and a facilitating role in terms of moving forward the agenda of effective cooperation and synergies, not only at the level of policy making and decision making through the various governing bodies of the conventions, but to translate a lot of these into actions on the ground. And I'm sure these of multilateral environmental agreements would recognize that since late 1970s, we have had a large number of multilateral environmental agreements that were negotiated and discussed and decided. We have more than 500 plus multilateral environmental agreements, of which close to 155 relate to biodiversity. Some of them are very, very significantly large, with almost what we call as universal membership, like the Convention on Biological Diversity with 196 parties. But there are also a large number of regional conventions, bilateral conventions that are related to biodiversity, 155 of them at least, as per the numbers. But of that, 6 key biodiversity agreements or conventions receive a lot of attention because of the nature of their work, but because also of the nature of the parties and the decision-making process. And these 6 together constitute what is also called as the Biodiversity Liaison Group, a group of key biodiversity MEAs that were established to coordinate work related to biodiversity actions and implementation. And these 6 key biodiversity conventions include the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on International Trade on Endangered Species, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the World Heritage Convention, and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. But essentially, not just these 6, but also the other biodiversity-related conventions work through their governing bodies or decision-making entities, supported by a set of scientific bodies that help the governing bodies in making decisions. But end of the day, all of these agreements are working towards one single goal. And how do we govern the environmental or biodiversity resources that are effective, where the benefits of such conservation is also shared equitably among different countries and members of the communities. So the key discussion among many of these conventions and the processes is how do we govern, how do we ensure that there is better management of these resources. But the decisions in relation to governance, implementation of the decisions that are taken through the multilateral processes, they happen at different levels. There are certain decisions that are taken at the level of the Conference of Parties, SBSTA, that stands for the Scientific Body on Scientific, Technical, and Technological Advice, the standing committees of these conventions, and of late, there is also a decision to establish a subsidiary body on implementation under the Convention on Biological Diversity, where the first meeting of the SBI we would look at this is all equivalent to a COP of an MEA. And previous to having UNEP established, in short, UNEP in short. But in turn, the decisions and the discussions coming out of these are picked up by the UN General Assembly, by the Economic and Social Council of the UN, and also a lot of other bodies. And a reflection of these, as you could also understand, are in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda that was adopted recently at the General Assembly meeting, and also a set of Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can recognize, for the first time, we have 2 specific goals of the 17 globally agreed Sustainable Development Goals that speak on issues related to biodiversity. So essentially, we are looking at a cascading way of making decisions and implementation, but also many times each of these bodies will have an influence or a role to play in terms of activities and implementation on the ground. And a lot of time when we are looking at talking about governing natural resources and the synergies discussions, enhancing cooperation, how do these agreements work together, and where is that we can have a better impact at the national or the local level. Essentially, they happen, as you can understand, at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. And so far, a large amount of discussions on cooperation and synergies had flown from global to local. So a lot more of decisions at the COPs and the UN Environment Assembly, General Assembly kind of bodies, picked up by the regional agencies, national governments, translated into actions on the ground. But certainly one thing that is relatively missing so far in the discourse is how does the local action influence global decision-making or policy-making when it comes to synergies? And that's where we still have a bit of a weakness, because a lot of time we still have not gotten our act together in terms of picking up the kinds of lessons and experiences on how collaboration happens at the local level and what are the experiences and the lessons learned that can be picked up to the global level. So we are now entering into a stage, but we are now only picking up threads on making sure that the future impacts of decision making is informed from local action to national action, national to regional, and regional to global. And a part of this particular webinar is also trying to understand and how to make this particular loop work a little better. But before we get into the discussion on the CBD, on the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, let us first ask ourselves a question of why do we need to cooperate? What's the big deal? Because these are all multilateral environmental agreements, which means member states have consciously debated, negotiated, and made a decision to establish these, whatever are the numbers. And each of them are being supported by the member states or the parties to these bodies in terms of decisions that are very specific to each of these convention or each of this agreement. So now the fundamental questions to ask ourselves is why cooperate, and why should we focus on synergies? And of course, it's quite a bit of a question with where common sense comes into play a role. We are looking at synergies or enhancing cooperation so that we can maximize the impacts of the activities, the decisions, and the implementation plans of each of these MEAs. So we're looking at maximizing the impacts. We also would like to talk of cooperation and synergies because we're also looking at improving the efficiency in which or by which we will be delivering the governance agenda through actions at different levels, regional, national, and local. We're also looking at synergies because we have, whatever is the country developed or developing, we also have a bit of issue of capacities, both human resource capacity, financial capacity, institutional capacities. So essentially, we are looking at synergies and cooperation so that we can manage our capacities and human resources relatively better. We also like to minimize gaps because remember, each of these conventions, each of these processes is negotiated by a set of people who actually focus on ensuring the mandate of each of these conventions is being appropriately delivered on the ground. But in doing so, there are possibilities that a bit of subject areas related to these could be falling through the cracks. So cooperation and synergies also helps us to minimize the kinds of gaps that potentially could harm action at the national or local level. We are also looking at cooperation to optimize resources. And as I said before, these are just not human resources, but they're also financial resources. How do we optimize the kind of finances we have so that at the end of the day, we deliver one agenda which is more coordinated and consolidated when it comes to work at national and local levels? And most importantly, to enhance local reach. Because definitely we can't go to a community representative or to a farmer and says that I'm going to give you mandates from CBD, from CMS, from the Ramsar Convention and the International Treaty, because for them, they just don't understand the jargon. For them, how do they make their actions, their livelihoods better? So one way to look at synergies is also that, does it help us in terms of enhancing local reach? But having said that, it's also important for us to keep in mind, when we are talking of synergies, when we are talking of cooperation, what is it not about? Because a lot of time, unless there is that bit of clarity on what is that we are not talking about in terms of synergies and cooperation, there is a possibility for us to mix up in terms of some issues that we're going to be discussing. So what cooperation and synergies is not about? It's not about centralizing powers and mandates. It's certainly not to say that we are going to be removing the mandate from this national focal point or this body or that standing committee or that COP or governing body. It is more in terms of looking at how do we maximize in terms of the better use of that kind of resources. It is not about minimizing costs alone. You're not talking of synergies and cooperation so that we can save some financial resources at different levels. It is beyond that. But certainly minimizing the cost is one of the criteria that a lot of people consider as a kind of an important element, but it is not the only element for us to think about synergies and cooperation. It's also not about reducing influence. When we are talking of cooperation and synergies, it's not to say who is going to be more influential in trying to make an implementation impact on the influence of different actors, make an impact on the ground to make a difference in implementation. And it is also not about compromising the impact. So certainly it's a combination of these that we should have in mind before we start looking at the other elements in the discourse related to enhancing cooperation, enhancing synergies. But I also will speak for a couple of minutes about what is the difference between mainstreaming and synergies, because a lot of time you would hear these two words mixed interchangeably used, but it's also important for us to understand what they mean and what they say. And this slide is basically to give you a bit of an idea on the cooperation and synergies in terms of how are the agendas set. And essentially, as I said before, it's a bit of a cascading impact. We are looking at issues of mandates, because the Convention on Migratory Species, for example, has a mandate to deliver on the issue of migratory species. The Convention on Heritage, the World Heritage Convention, speaks about the cultural and natural heritage related issues. The International Treaty speaks about the need for securing genetic resources through a multilateral system of exchange so that the global food security is not compromised. So essentially, the issues of mandates are given by the individual conventions and their mandates. And what normally happens is that that cascades into the next level, which is the issues of influence and reach. How each of these kinds of MEAs or the conventions are able to have a reach, and what is the kind of influence that they would have, or they are likely to have, or they should be having. And that talks about the convening capacity. And that is why sometimes when we speak of biodiversity conventions, the Convention on Biodiversity is always called as the larger convention, because it has got a much larger capacity, because it has 196 countries as members or parties to the convention. So it's also an issue of how much of influence and what kind of reach some of these conventions have, compared to a regional convention, which perhaps is about 2 or 3 countries working in a small sub-region in a particular continent. And also, it is also an issue, it's also an important element to talk about the issues of delivery. What kind of an oversight that some of these MEAs have, and what kind of an outreach and capacity they have in terms of the oversight, that they're able to manage some of these over a period of time. But when we are trying to do it, it is also important for us, as I mentioned a few slides before, in terms of looking at how do we deliver the agenda. We can talk of synergies, we can talk of cooperation, but there should be appropriate elements of this discourse that should be picked up by strategic elements of the discussions that happen at different levels. It has to be picked up by the political system. It has to be picked up by the economic component of it. And that is why I've just put this slide to say that where the individual MEAs and the programs, through their conference of parties, through the standing committees, contribute to the next level of delivering that agenda or making an influence, which, for example, is like through the United Nations Environment Assembly, where the ministers of environment sit and then make certain resolutions and certain decisions, which in turn feeds into the discussions at the level of heads of state through the General Assembly process. So the reason why I just mentioned some of these specifics is for us to understand that even though each of these discussions happen at individual convention level, there is a need for us to coalesce many of these decisions so that they actually contribute to a larger decision making when it comes to overall issue of managing our nature, managing the biological resources more sustainably and more equitably. Now I'm going to a bit of specifics on where is this mandate coming from. How are the conventions and the conference of the parties, which are the governing bodies of these conventions, responding to some of these kinds of issues? And as you can see, this is just a snapshot. It's not a full exhaustive list of the COP decisions that actually are coming from each of the convention in terms of requesting, encouraging, and also supporting synergies among the biodiversity-related convention decisions, the International Convention on International Trade on Endangered Species, Migratory Species Convention, the treaty, the Ramsar, that each of the governing body multiple cooperation and have asked for cooperation and synergies to maximize the delivery of the mandate of each of these conventions, but essentially working together. But the decisions of these COPs also are based on a certain number of triggers, a certain number of key triggers. Several years ago, we've been discussing about the issue of enhancing cooperation. The discussions were more on how do we coordinate action at the national level in terms of reporting to some of these conventions. And I've just given you one example, but there are more than one example. The issue of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. There, the reports of the Ramsar Convention are considered as a report that could be used effectively in decision making in terms of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So one of the triggers in terms of this discussion is that can there be, or there is already some work that is happening in terms of coordinated, consolidated way of national reporting, where a report can feed into more than one governing body negotiation process. The second one is actually a report of the Joint Inspection Unit, which is a body established under the United Nations that actually a few years ago, prior to 2010, reviewed the kind of work that happens at the level of, and they actually came up with a set of recommendations, but the core point of the recommendation is that there is a need for enhanced synergies or cooperation, because that is the only way with the available resources, capacities, and influences, countries would be able to deliver on the governance agenda with respect to biodiversity. Subsequently, Government of Finland in Helsinki organized a meeting in 2010 where they actually brought together a set of experts and also members of the secretariats of the multilateral environmental agreements, where perhaps for the first time we had a very, very intense debate on how to make this interest of cooperation work on the ground. How does it look when we are talking of cooperation and synergies? And the report of the Helsinki meeting was also one of the triggers in terms of enhanced discussions and debates at the level of COPs of many of these MEAs. In preparation for the 2010 CBD, the Biological Diversity Convention Strategic Plan, the UN Environment Management Group, which actually is a group of UN agencies, different UN agencies, where they have a bit of work program interest and a mandate to work on environment, come together to work on common approaches to dealing with environmental issues. And the Environment Management Group is chaired by UNEP. And in preparation for the strategic plan of 2010 for the convention, the Environment Management Group established an issues management group where they brought together different UN agencies to come together to understand and also to provide options on how to work together at the level of UN agencies in delivering the biodiversity agenda on the ground. So that was also one of the important, not just a technical document, but that was also a very important trigger in terms of looking at the synergies and the cooperation components of it. The adoption of the CBD strategic plan was a significant milestone because, as many of you would recognize, that this is a strategic plan which has got a life between 2011 to 2020. So the decade of biodiversity coincides with the strategic plan of the convention. So certainly that was also one of the important figures. But more importantly, the Biodiversity Liaison Group, which actually is a group of the Biodiversity MEAs, the 6 MEAs, but currently, as of a few months, the International Plant Protection Convention has also been invited to be a part of the BLG. So now it becomes 7 conventions with the International Plant Protection Convention also coming on board. But in 2010, the Biodiversity Liaison Group made a very, very important discussion point and an agreement that since there is a CBD strategic plan that considers elements of biodiversity from the angles of conservation, sustainable use, access and benefit sharing, is it worth for the other MEAs to consider the elements of the strategic plan as an important base for developing the strategic plan for different MEAs? And that was actually a turning point because currently the different multilateral environmental agreements on biodiversity, the CMS, the CITES, they explicitly link the activities the strategic plans of these individual conventions into 2000. Then the strategic plans of the individual MEAs that were developed after 2010, considering the elements of the CBD strategic plan. And lastly and importantly, where we are still trying to get grips on how to integrate these interests within the overarching framework of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And even though, as you will know that Goal 15 and Goal 14 and 15 are directly related to biodiversity, biodiversity plays a very, very important role in achieving or implementing actions in dealing with the majority of the SDGs, not just SDG 14 and 15. So that's also a very important trigger that is pushing a lot of people, institutions, and countries to talk about more cooperation and more synergies, because that's the overarching development agenda that has been agreed at the level of heads of state. And where does UNEP come into this entire picture? UNEP in 2012, at that time, there was no Environment Assembly. It was called the Governing Council, which was the Governing Council of UNEP, actually requested, it invited the Executive Director of UNEP to undertake activities to improve the effectiveness and cooperation among MEAs. But in doing so, to ensure that the decision-making aspect of each of these MEAs, as autonomous as they are, should be kept in mind when it actually comes up with some options on how to enhance synergies among the biodiversity-related MEAs as well as MEAs in general. And this was further strengthened by paragraph 89 of the outcome document of Rio Plus 20 in 2012, which is called the Future We Want, which also calls for enhanced cooperation amongst the multilateral environmental agreements in achieving the 2030 development agenda, sustainable development agenda. So one of the set of activities that UNEP did in the last couple of years, just for you to have an overview on how things are moving in terms of the enhancing cooperation and synergies, is that it started working between 2014 and 15. The last 2 years started working on some of these issues in identifying the options. We've been talking about synergies and cooperation. We know the importance of it. We know what it is not about, and there are lots of dimensions of the decisions that are coming. But how do you make it? What are the kinds of options that different stakeholders would have? MEA Secretariat would have, a national government would have, UN agency would have, civil society would have. So in preparation for that, in 2014, UNEP undertook an online survey of the national focal points of all the 6 biodiversity MEAs at that time, where inputs were sought in terms of what is the current thinking and understanding, and also the need for looking at synergies and cooperation. And the results of it were analyzed, and there were 2 expert meetings that happened. And these 2 expert meetings were actually experts meetings that laid the foundation for a little bit more of a coherent approach in terms of identifying the options. So in September 2015, the options paper was finalized, and UNEP made a presentation to its committee of permanent representatives, what we call as CPR, who actually are the representatives of the member states of the UN, its agenda for the Environment Assembly. So on the 3rd of December, a presentation was made to the CPR on what these options are. I'll mention some of these options in a minute. And subsequently, these will be taken for next round of discussions at what we call as the open-ended CPR meeting that is happening in February 2016, who will be discussing some of these elements so that an appropriate decision or a resolution can be sought or can be provided for at the next meeting of the Environment Assembly, which is now slated for May 2016. So this is a kind of a timeline in terms of the activities, what happened. But it is more or less a kind of a representation of it. So essentially, now we are actually at a stage where we actually have what is called the know-how of it, but it's now the next phase of it will be to have the do-how of it. And in preparation for the implementation of the options, UNEP also undertook a series of activities. I'll mention that in a minute. But these are in addition to lots of complementary activities that are going on at the level of national governments, at the level of UN agencies, and also at the level of individual MEA secretariats also. And of course, as you can understand, when we are talking of cooperation and synergies, we are talking at different levels. We are talking global level synergies that are needed in terms of decision-making, policy setting, national, regional level in terms of prioritization, and also national level in terms of translating some of these into actions on the ground. And essentially, all of these require a multiple set of actors to function and perform, but also it will have an impact on multiple sectors. So you have many actors and many sectors who will be a part of this entire process at different levels. And who actually participated in developing these options? The secretariats themselves, or the representatives of the secretariats, the hosting institutions, the focal points, the regional colleagues of UNEP, other experts in their personal capacity, and donor representatives. And certainly we'd like to acknowledge the support of European Union, governments of Switzerland and Finland in supporting this entire process. But what does the options look like? Of course, there are 7 thematic areas that are identified as critical for achieving this cooperation and synergies. I'll mention on what those areas in a minute. There are 25 options that are identified for enhancing synergies. Under each of these options, very specific recommendations, action points are made in terms of addressing, but each one of these actions are directed towards a particular set of agencies, MEAs, UN, national governments, civil society, and others. And as you can understand, that these actually build on the existing or the past experiences and activities. And what is expected as outcome? Coherent implementation of the MEAs at different levels, increased cooperation between the MEAs as well as among the MEAs, and enhanced impact of delivery along with agencies like UNEP. So this actually is what is expected as an outcome of this entire process. And those, as you can see on the screen, are the 7 thematic areas that are identified as critical for achieving synergies. Top of it is the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, the Strategic Plan of the Biodiversity Convention, the CBD, and also the Aichi Biodiversity Targets. How do we make, or how do we ensure that all of these translate activities into decisions on the ground in terms of enhancing synergies. Options related to reporting requirements, monitoring and indicators related to reporting and monitoring. The role of the Science Policy Interface. IPBES, as many of you may know, stands for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. How we can work on science policy links to enhance that cooperation and deliver it on the ground using the interface much more carefully and much more vigorously. Information management and awareness raising as a support mechanism and tool for achieving synergies. Building capacities for delivering actions on the ground which are more synergistic. Looking at funding and the resource efficiency components of it. Because as you can understand, of the 6 or the 7 key biodiversity MEAs we are talking about, if you're going to take the example of the Global Environment Facility for the time being, the Global Environment Facility funding is available only to the Convention on Biological Diversity and not to the other conventions as of now. So is there a need for countries to start working in terms of enhanced cooperation and synergies as and when they are developing and designing the programs, so that the collective mandates or the work related to the other conventions can also be appropriately reflected within the plans, action plans of the CBD, so that there is the possibility of attracting enough funding, including from sources like GF. And lastly, the most important element to deliver it on the ground at the national level is to ensure that there is appropriate institutional collaboration. And each of these 7 areas, a set of options and a set of action points are already identified. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll give you the web links. From there, you can download this particular report and read further in terms of what those options are and what those action points look like and who are they addressed or who are they targeted to as well. And in the day, the result of this entire process is to have certain stakeholders involved in this debate, not just within the MEAs, or how do we benefit? Looking at our importance or acknowledging the work that has already happened, the value of engaging with different institutions, and also importantly, how does this link with our responsibility of responding to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Developments? And lastly, and most importantly, how to work with different stakeholder groups to continue and promote mutually supportive efforts and approaches. And the 4 bullets are 5 bullets on the screen that you see as guiding the future actions of not just outreach, but also as a kind of a building block for looking at delivering the ideas that emanated from this entire set of discussions for the last several years. One is the NBSAP Forum. And thanks to the NBSAP Forum, which is to come together and work together on issues of how to help countries deliver not just better and functional NBSAPs, but to also help countries to deal with effective implementation of the biodiversity strategies and action plans as and when they are adopted and communicated to CBD. The forum is an important platform. UNEP also worked with using the background work that went into 2-3 years of work in terms of identifying these options to come up with a source book. And this source book is available for free download online, and I'll provide you the details in a minute. And this source book not only gives you a bit of background to the issue, but it also has an enormous number of country-based case studies and experiences, these issues of synergies and cooperation on the ground. So it's a very useful resource to look at what countries are doing in terms of this work. National reporting tools, which is already available, and some of them are currently being developed, including through the discussions at the Convention on Biological Diversity. Looking at the legal and policy preparedness to deliver on the ground in terms of synergies is work that we are collectively doing with the CBD Secretariat, UNEP, and also organizations like the IDLO, the International Development Law Organization, and also a series of national actions that as we go forward in implementing or realizing some of these options on the ground. So essentially, these all translate to the NBSAPs and the related actions. They also are to be reflected in the UN Development Assistance Frameworks, which is an important document or an important tool we have to use in terms of delivering the agenda nationally, streaming these into the Sustainable Development Goal related implementation plans at the national level. So let's switch gears now and look at what countries are already doing. You may be aware that in response to Article 6 of the Convention, countries are to do two very, very important things. One is to develop a national strategy and an action plan related to the biodiversity component or to implement the Convention. And that is 6A of the CBD, Article 6A. And 6B is about mainstreaming biodiversity across different sectors. And as you can see from the pie chart, you will know that we have so far 184 countries who have already submitted their NBSAPs. But since the adoption of the new strategic plan of the convention and since the decision of COP10 to revise and update the national biodiversity strategies and action plans by 2015, we actually have post 2050 NBSAPs that actually, some of them are being updated and revised, but we also have 12 of the NBSAPs that have been submitted to the convention secretariat, which are the NBSAPs developed by countries for the first time. So these are not updated, but they are actually NBSAPs for the first time. So we have responded to three different things. One, looking at the implementation experience of the previous iterations of the NBSAPs, which is pre-2010, responding to the strategic plan of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also responding to the need in terms of achieving the global biodiversity targets by the year 2020. So what assessment that was done in 2014 and the report was published in 2015, where a small set of countries were identified based on their submissions to the CBD on what kind of information had gone into these revised or updated NBSAPs, not just in terms of synergies and cooperation, but across a range of elements of the strategic plan as well as the Aichi biodiversity targets. And this report and this assessment provided us two or three very key lessons. We only had 25 countries who have submitted their post 2010 NBSAPs. So certainly it's not a complete assessment nor a full assessment of considering all the countries who have submitted their NBSAPs after the assessment was done. One, very few of the revised or updated NBSAPs specifically mention the issue of synergies, but some of them do mention about the issue of mainstreaming. The second generation of NBSAPs in general terms consider the issue of mainstreaming as important, and synergies need to be found, but the relevant action plans to translate that interest of mainstreaming and synergies into actions on the ground at that time for the 25 that were assessed. However, if you look at the complete set of NBSAPs as they are submitted and available on now, you can see that quite a few countries have already started looking at synergies and mainstreaming as an important element of their own revised NBSAPs. And I've just given you a few examples of countries like New York, Seychelles, Sudan, Guyana, Jordan, where each of them, through very specific projects, objectives of their revised NBSAP or string about synergies much more of implementation as of the revised NBSAP. If you're going to be categorizing, and this is not a complete categorization because I could not fit everything into this slide, at least if you're going to look at mainstreaming and synergies, what are the three important criteria that one should have in mind? Or what are the three opportunities at the national level? Institutional opportunities. Is there any way countries can better coordinate within the institutions or among institutions in terms of achieving synergies? And we do have very good examples. I've just picked up one or two important ones. Not to say that there are many others who are there, but these are two, like, couple of examples I could pick up: Egypt and Finland. And these two countries have really institutionalized a better way of enhancing cooperation within the units or within the ministries of environment and within the biodiversity secretariats in terms of working together across different MEAs so that it is more effective and it is more impactful. We also have certain number of countries who had put in a set of programmatic approaches to looking at cooperation and synergies. And I picked up Bhutan and new countries are looking at programmatic cooperation across MEAs much more effectively compared to other countries. And also we have certain countries who have looked at it from a financial perspective in terms of looking at how do I maximize my every dollar spent in different MEAs. And Palau stands as a good example of doing it. So essentially, whether it is better implementation, whether it is better coordination, or better management of resources, we do now have certain kinds of guidance posts that are available for countries to start looking at enhancing cooperation synergies, and again using NBSAPs as an anchor, where you can look at institutional issues, you can look at programmatic issues, and you can also look at financial issues of maximizing the impact of use of money available. But having said that, let me now come to the point of how do we understand the issue of synergies agenda? How do we move the synergies agenda forward? And one question I always ask myself, I hear many times, is that can synergies and mainstreaming be different? And for those of you who are following the mainstreaming and synergies agenda would recognize, in general, mainstreaming has been a kind of word in the lexicon of MEAs for a long time. We've been talking about mainstreaming for the last almost a decade. But when it comes to synergies, a lot of people understand synergies only as synergies and cooperation amongst the secretariats of the MEAs, looking at the administrative issues, looking at the financial issues. But I think to me, that kind of an understanding and approach is relatively incorrect, to the extent that when we are talking of synergies, we are also talking more importantly, which to me is a low-hanging fruit, are the programmatic or strategic thematic synergies that are possible. And I want to give you one or two examples. Achieving mainstreaming without synergies. Is it possible that we can work on mainstreaming, but we will not talk about synergies? And I just picked up CBD COP and CMS. Think of it, how does the sustainable use program of the Convention on Biological Diversity be delivered without synergistic actions that includes the decisions and the work programs of CITES and CMS? So for us to achieve the issues, we have to have synergies in place. Can we achieve synergies without mainstreaming? Under the Convention on Biological Diversity, we have Article 15 on access and benefit sharing. And then we have the Nagoya Protocol that relates to implementation of Article 15 now under the Convention, with access and benefit sharing provisions, and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food Agriculture that also speaks about access and benefit sharing. So can we talk of synergies without looking at mainstreaming the work between these two elements of Nagoya Protocol and the treaty at the national level? It certainly is not possible. So that's why I just put that graphic there, or that picture there, to say that synergies and mainstreaming need to be also understood and appreciated as two sides of the same coin. And we will run a risk if we are going to be completely separating them as a substantive process and a political process. And that is something which we have to avoid. So if this is so, why countries are finding it difficult to deal with these issues? Still, countries are finding it difficult, and that's the truth. Is it about communicating these issues, or is it about minimal understanding of the concepts that we are talking about? Or is it having a tunnel vision, where things are so close to us, and especially for the focal points who deal with these conventions and the process day in and day out, they find it very difficult to understand the links or the relationship with the other elements of the other MEAs. And that's where some guidance is required. Some clarity is required. And for us to do it, we first have to simplify. We need to understand some of these concepts in a much simpler way. And what kind of guidance is available? The NBSAP Forum and the MEA Synergies. As you can understand, or as you can see from your screens, the forum is playing an important role in terms of providing certain kind of guidance and suggestions and resources for countries to start looking at these issues. The UNEP Sourcebook that I mentioned speaks about experiences, case studies, and examples from countries on how already this is being practiced or this is being put in place. And we also have a very, very important knowledge sharing platform established jointly by UNEP and also all the different multilateral environmental agreements, InforMEA in short, which is one of the key knowledge sharing, knowledge bridging mechanisms that are available to deal with synergies, which is effectively also being used. And currently, we're looking at developing a lot more of form. The graphic there and the numbers that you can see from your screens just is a representational indication of how individuals, countries, focal points are now beginning to use InforMEA portal in terms of better understanding of some of these issues. And then this webinar in itself is a kind of a supporting activity in terms of synergies, but there is also a plan early next year we'll do a South-South knowledge sharing workshop where some of the resources that I mentioned would also be used in terms of dealing with it. But in terms of the future plans, certainly a lot of work has gone in. A lot of decisions are taken at the level of individual MEAs through the governing bodies, the COPs of the MEAs. But now how do we link it up, or how do we move it to the next iteration, next phase of trying to get a larger influence in terms of decision making on cooperation and synergies is to take it to the level of environment ministers through the UN Environment Assembly, where the second meeting of the Assembly will happen in May next year, where, thanks to the government of Switzerland and supported by a few other countries, there is an indication that there will be a resolution that will be provided at decision secretaries in terms of trying to enhance cooperation and synergies. And indications are there is going to be the next level of guidance that will be available for moving forward the synergies agenda. We're also looking at national projects, pilot projects, whether they are institutional components, the programmatic components, or financial components. Can we look at some pilots where countries can start putting some of these kinds of mechanisms in place on a pilot basis and using that experience in terms of future actions? Doing an assessment across MEAs on the COP guidance available, and most importantly, linking some of these discussions to actual actions, whether it is development of indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals or implementation effectiveness of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, not just at the global level, but more importantly at the national level. So these are some of the kinds of plans that are currently on the anvil. But there are a few key challenges as well. And what are those? First, it's very important that there should be an enhanced understanding and ownership by the parties of this entire process. Because whether it's an MEA Secretariat or UNEP, the organizations, the entities are there to deliver the mandate that is provided to them by their own governing bodies or by the parties or the members of UNEP or the MEA. Not only on the details of the synergies and cooperation, but also on the need to cooperate, we'll have a bit of a challenge. There should be enhanced cooperation, enhanced national actions, and we need support for that. Not just financial support, but also technical capacities and also hand-holding over a longer period of time so that these institutions cannot be run on a project mode. You can't go to a country and say, let's work together on establishing a biodiversity secretariat, fund it for 2 years and say we've done our job, and after 2 years or 3 years, the secretariat doesn't function. So it has to be a long-term process in terms of national investment into national actions. And moving from synergies by default, because the reason why I say it is that the examples that are picked up by the source book prepared by UNEP and UNEP WCMC, a large examples are actually activities related to synergies that happen by default. They're not designed to happen in a particular manner. And it is very important that we now move from the default-based action into design-based action. Between the COP decisions and UNEA resolutions. You can't have one MEA COP deciding on something, another MEA COP deciding on something, and UNEA deciding on something else, because the very purpose of this discussion on synergies and cooperation would be lost, and also making an impact on the ground. These are my 2 or 3 last slides. What are these opportunities available at the national level? Programmatic, strategic. And we need to work at all the 4 different levels. And it is time that we start having some experience gathering through actions on how does it work from local to national. Because unless that particular loop is closed, the kind of convincing that needs to be done for national focal points is going to be not that very easy. And we also need to move from national to too tough for us to have or look at coordinated or synergistic actions on the ground. And the slide gives you a bit of details of the key resources that are already available, and the last 3 bullet points are the kinds of materials or resources that are under finalization or preparation. And those are the kinds of websites of both the MEAs and also organizations where you can look for some information. But of course, this is not a complete or an exhaustive list, but this is a very indicative list of where you can get some more information. But that's not where I'm going to end the presentation, and that's why I said hold on. What is now happening is that there is a CBD-led process, the Convention on Biological Diversity-led process, in terms of looking at enhanced cooperation and synergies among biodiversity MEAs. And where is that coming from? It comes actually from a 2014 decision of CBD COP, where it is actually looking at, it decided to establish an informal advisory group to look at options that could include elements of a possible roadmap for enhancing cooperation and synergies. So essentially, we are looking at a decision of COP12, which will now begin to work, which will begin to happen, or which will begin to unfold as we speak into the next few months in terms of looking at options for synergies. And there's going to be a study on key capacity building that is anticipated out of it, and also identification of capacity building awareness before mid-next year to be considered by the subsidiary body of implementation of the Convention 2016 to discuss this particular agenda. And an important element of it is a large part of that discussion, hopefully, should be based on the work or the available information that has already been prepared by different agencies, including UNEP. And based on that, I'll start, and this is my last slide, where we are looking at if there is sufficient interest, and based on, it will be more like a hands-on experience sharing or write shop in terms of providing practical guidance on mainstreaming and synergies. I thank you for your attention, and I'll now pass an answer session of this particular webinar.
Many thanks, Dr. Pisupati, for this interesting topic and your conference and knowledge. I hope our participants found it as useful as me. Thank you again. I would like to open our session of questions. If you want to do a question, please send them through our chat or raising your hand in the control panel or in your GoToWebinar session. Then I can give you the microphone for so. So let us know your question, please. You need to raise your hand because all of you are now on mute. So let me know if you have questions.
Diego, can you just guide them on how to raise the hand? What do they do?
Let me 1 second. I think you cannot see it, but we are having some of them. Okay, go ahead. Anil Kumar.
Hi, Bala. This is Anil from India. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Anil.
Yeah. So my question is, see, you talked extensively on mainstreaming and synergizing, various MEAs. That was very interesting presentation. You gave a very detailed picture of what is happening at global level and also to some extent at the national level. So I have 2 questions. One is, what are the current level efforts of UNEP in mainstreaming or synergizing some of these MEAs, especially the MEA related with biodiversity, I mean the CBD? And second question is, how the local level efforts, because you are the first slide, and you repeated that slide where the learning from the local on the ground learning to the global level. So what are the challenges now with reference to such kind of local level learning? When I looked into these kind of issues, there are no much efforts to build the capacity of the local stakeholders in participating in the mainstreaming of biodiversity. Not even participating correctly in preparing the NBSAP. So forget about the mainstreaming, because unless they participate effectively in the preparation of the NBSAPs, they may not be able to involve in the process of mainstreaming. So the questions, let me make it clear, the two parts. One is at the global level, the effort of UNEP in mainstreaming or synergizing the biodiversity related MEAs, and also at the local level, what are the efforts to build the capacity of local communities to involve in the mainstream. Thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Pisupati.
Diego, I should admit that I was only able to hear half of that question. If you can quickly repeat the question? Sorry, Diego, because the audio was just not available for part of the question.
Can you hear me now?
Hello? Yes. Go ahead, Anil.
So
yeah, go ahead, Anil.
Yeah, my first question was about the UNEP's effort in mainstreaming this CBD related MEA. What are the efforts of UNEP currently taking at the global level? That was the first part of my question. Second was, if you look at the local level efforts in mainstreaming the biodiversity in governance, now the local level efforts in a country like India are much negligible. So what are the kind of actions required to strengthen such kind of community level efforts?
Okay, thank you. Now the questions are clear. In terms of UNEP efforts, as you can understand, a bit of that last few slides that I presented are elements of the UNEP's efforts, not only in terms of moving up to the level of providing an options paper for discussion, but also in terms of looking at some very specific guidance for those countries who are finalizing, who are preparing their revised NBSAP or the first generation NBSAPs to integrate elements of how to look at synergies and mainstreaming into their NBSAPs, a bit of capacity building, sharing of experiences, lessons, and also national level actions as much as possible. So that's the kind of a set of efforts. But also, just to read, it will be done in isolation by UNEP. It will be definitely in partnership with the secretariats, because they are the ones who really are working with the parties and the member states in terms of some of these processes as well, number one. In terms of local efforts, as I mentioned, that's one level of discussion or discourse that is missing, and that is where two things need to happen. One, a country need to, a few countries have done it, but countries need to look at development and implementation of NBSAPs. How do you take it at the level of regions? How do you take it at the level of provinces? How do you take it at the level of districts? Because unless you are going to be doing it, the level of ownership will only be with the Ministry of Environment at the national level, and then there'll be a bit of a struggle on how do you collect information and share experiences. That is one part of it. The other part of it, a lot of time, a lot of synergistic action do happen on the ground, and that's what I said is the missing link. And it is our responsibility for those of us who are working on these issues to also capture some of these lessons and transmit it at the national level and also at the global level. And certainly there should be a platform available, and over a period of time, I'm sure we should be able to identify a kind of a knowledge sharing platform on this. But currently the NBSAP Forum can be one of a very good mechanism that can be used in terms of sharing that experience.
Thank you, Dr. Pisupati. I have another question from Royal Gardner. He is asking, is the CBD Informal Advisory Group examining how to make better use of or energize the CSAV chairs of the scientific advisory bodies? And Royal, I'm going to put you on the microphone if you want to add more on your question. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much. That was a very, very useful presentation. I'm the chair of the Ramsar Scientific Technical and Review Panel, and one of the areas for synergy is among and between the chairs of the various scientific advisory bodies. So I'd be interested in knowing whether the CBD Informal Advisory Group that was mentioned toward the end of the presentation is looking at that as a possible avenue for collaboration as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. I think that's a very, very important question. And certainly, yes, the Biodiversity Liaison Group, I'm sure, would consider elements because, as we understand, the role of the scientific advisory bodies is so very critical because a lot of time the decisions that are taken at the governing bodies are based on the outcomes of standing committees, scientific bodies, substance, and things like that. But having said that, two things. One is how do you effectively make use of the guidance and suggestions and advice is one part of it. The other part of it, how do you use this particular body into a kind of a future mapping and future planning element of this as well. And one of the ideas is still to be confirmed. We just put a placeholder, is the possibility of having a meeting of the chairs of scientific bodies on the margins of the forthcoming Environment Assembly meeting. We still are working on the details of it. It's still not confirmed, but that will be one opportunity from UNEP we are trying to make use of exactly to address the question that you raised on not only to look at coordination and cooperation among the bodies or members of the bodies, but also between the different elements of agencies, MEA secretariats, as well as the governing bodies.
Thank you, Dr. Fitzpatrick. Sorry, we have a question from Elizabeth Mrema. She's asking, what are your personal views on the ownership of the different MEA secretariats on the synergies issues which are currently well embraced by the parties? I'm going to put Elizabeth on the microphone. Go ahead, Elizabeth. Can you hear us?
Yes, that was my question. I mean, I worked with many colleagues in the MEA secretariats. We also know at times there are quite a bit of debates. Is an acceptable theme, particularly from the secretariat point of view, while we seem to be getting more push pressure from the parties as one would have wished also from the secretariat. And I thought Bala might have some views, whether that's also his observation, and if so, what views does he have on that?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I was able to hear parts of your question, but the key element of your question, I am a little lost. So if you don't mind, can you repeat the central part of the question? Because the audio was very unclear.
Elizabeth, can you hear us? Hello? Dr. Pisupati? Can you hear me?
My question is, what are your personal views?
Hello?
I think we are
Hello?
having some problems with Elizabeth's connection. I'm going to read again, and I hope Elizabeth can.
No, but I don't know whether she, but if you can just repeat the question, the key part of it.
I'm going.
Hello?
Can you hear me, Dr. Pisupati?
Yes, go ahead, Vigo.
I'm going to read Elizabeth's question because I think she's having problem with the connection. So, what are your personal views on the ownership of the different MEA secretariats on the synergies issues, which are currently well embraced by the parties?
Can you hear me, Bala?
Yes, now I can hear you, and also got a gist of your question is that what's the personal view in terms of the ownership of different MEAs?
The facilitator I've written it. Which are currently. Can you probably read it to him?
Can you send out the question through the chat? So probably it's better to read it because the connection.
Okay, now I can get the question here. What are your personal views on the ownership of the different MEA secretariats on the synergies issues which are currently being embraced by the parties, right? Hello?
Go ahead, Dr. Pisupati, with the answer.
Hello, Vigo. Can I go?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that bit of a problem. I mean, you're absolutely right. Let me put my answer into two parts. First part, the role of the secretariats.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So the role of secretariats is more to service and then help the member states in terms of moving forward the agenda. That's why we are called secretariats. It's UNEP secretariat, it's MEA secretariats kind of a thing. But in terms of the ownership of some of these issues, personally for me, we still have a bit of a challenge in terms of people trying to understand. And that was on there, the kinds of issues of the need for moving forward on synergies. I recently had put a slide in my presentation that speaks about what synergies mainstreaming discussions are not about. And personally for me, those 3 or 4 questions that are points that are mentioned in that slide, perhaps are the set of issues or the kinds of understanding that some, I would say secretariats in general, but some colleagues in the secretariat still are trying hard to understand. And certainly, the last part of your question, if the parties are going to be embracing, if the parties are going to be wanting to do it, the role of the secretariats is nothing but to facilitate what the parties want. And that's my personal view.
Thank you very much. I am just writing to Elizabeth to see if the question was answered because we are having some problems with the connection. We have another question from Mustafa Madbouhi. I just sent to you, but I'm going to read it to facilitate. You do not believe that it is not necessary that the synergy appears clearly in the strategy because it is national document and that all partners are required to implement this strategy?
No, I certainly believe, because if the national strategy or the national action plan clearly outlines the kind of approach and the kind of mechanism, the actions that will be implemented to facilitate synergies. I'd be more than pleased and happy to understand that that intent is there, and support should be provided for such kind of strategies to make some of these happen, so that it's not just looking at having a few paragraphs in a document, but translates into actions on the ground. So I have no doubt. I completely believe that if it is a part of the strategy, that's an intent to have it working when it comes to implementation.
I open the microphone to Mostafa if he or she, I'm sorry, if he wants to add something to the question. Okay, he says thank you. I have another question from Naeem Ashraf Raja. It's asking, seeing the global focus on climate change talks, why cannot we make CBD more globally visible? That shall definitely generate political backstopping and ultimate synergies.
Okay, let me quickly respond. Certainly, the Biodiversity Convention or the CBD already has that visibility. Of course, the International Year of Biodiversity had demonstrated it. The UN adopting an international decade on biodiversity demonstrates that. The strategic plan demonstrates that. The guidance that MEAs and countries are making use of the CBD strategic plan, all of these demonstrate the kind of visibility, the kind of importance that a convention like the CBD has. But biodiversity is an issue that actually needs a larger visibility. It requires larger support. It requires strategic and political support as well. So to me, my answer to the question is, it is not as if we do not have the global visibility. We do have it, but it is only how do we enhance it so that it's just not staying at the level of global, but it also permeates to national, regional, subnational, and also local. And that is why if you look at the Aichi Biodiversity targets, the first target talks about enhancing awareness and also ensuring that people are aware of the value and the use of biodiversity, which in other words translates not just to the visibility of CBD, but also to the other biodiversity MEAs as well.
Thanks. I'm going to open the microphone to Naeem. Can you hear us?
Thank you very much. Yes, I can. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, talking of all the synergies, in the current climate change talks, all our, political leadership is there. And that's, I think, the case with the rest of the world as well. And if, like we moved people in our 1992 in Rio, our prime minister was there, that level of involvement of the political leadership is needed to actually get sort of confirmed commitment from the political leadership. So I wonder that we still don't have that as we have it in climate change. So if we could do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me quickly respond that these are my personal views. This is my personal answer. See, exactly what you said is very correct, and that is why in one of the slides I had this cascading, elements of not just the individual conventions making a decision, but how do we ensure that that particular decision reaches the appropriate platform so that it will receive that kind of an attention. For example, if there is going to be a decision that is made by CITES or CMS or CBD, and if it stays at the level of national reach, is going to be limited. But think of it that you have a decision which is picked up by the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is the global assembly on environmental issues, and subsequently the Environment Assembly informs the General Assembly on some of these issues that needs to be receiving larger attention. That is where we actually have a much more impact. And that is why we talk of synergies, not at the level of programs, but also at the level of institutions, because each of these institutions has a mandate to deliver. There is, see, one of the very fundamental elements of it is that the institutional collaboration in delivering on synergies is about complementarity, and it is not about competition of mandates. And the moment we can do it, because the reason why climate change is receiving so much of attention is that it's directly under the UN General Assembly, directly under the auspices. I mean, the Secretary General himself is sitting in Paris, overseeing the discussions and the debates that are going on. So for us to move this particular element into that level of visibility, we actually need to work in a manner that is coordinated, but also an incremental approach, so that the level of influence that some of these debates on biodiversity makes could reach to that kind of an audience. It cannot be done in an year, but concrete, everybody coming together, completely understanding that each of the MEA is autonomous, it has its mandate, it has its member states and parties guiding its decisions, completely understood and honored and taken on board. But how do we make all of this work at the level of a larger political agenda, political dimension, so that the issue is more important than where is it coming from? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are just finishing. We don't have more questions at this point. So I would like to thank again Dr. Pisupati for your attendance to this conference and for sharing your knowledge on this interesting topic. I would like to thanks also to thank our participants to attend this webinar, the final one in our 2015 NBSAP Forum series. This presentation will be available through email and also through our website, www.nbsapforum.net. And please take care of our Twitter and Facebook account for the latest discussions around NBSAP. Stay tuned for the upcoming webinars in 2016. And thank you very much, everybody, and especially Dr. Bala for your presentation. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Diego, and thanks for all the participants. And if you have any questions, please do let us know. And your input suggestions are will be helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day or night, depending on the part of the planet you are. Thank you very much, and see you next year in the next session of webinars to the NBSAP Forum. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.